In the quiet, unsuspecting town of Cedarville, Montana, Jason Statham, a disabled veteran, leads an unremarkable life. With his wheelchair as a constant companion, he moves through the town unnoticed, playing the role of a broken man. However, beneath the surface of this small-town routine lies a man with a past that few can imagine, a man who once served as one of the military's most lethal combat specialists. The explosion that took his legs in Afghanistan did not break him, it only sharpened his resolve. Now, under the guise of a disabled vet, Jason is an undercover FBI agent, investigating the notorious Red Dragons motorcycle gang and their multi-million-dollar weapons trafficking operation. His carefully constructed cover is about to be tested when the Red Dragons, led by the vicious Marcus, the Snake Wilson, target him, thinking they see a weak and vulnerable man. But Jason's wheelchair is not just a symbol of his loss, it is a tool of deception, concealing hidden combat abilities and high-tech gadgets. What the gang doesn't realize is that the very thing they believe makes him defenseless is the key to their downfall. As the Red Dragons make their move, Jason's mission to dismantle their criminal empire begins, and the quiet afternoon at Mike's corner store becomes the first chapter in a battle that will change everything. Jason Statham's life and mission. Jason Statham never expected his quiet afternoon at Mike's corner store in the small town of Cedarville to turn into a life-changing showdown. Cedarville was a place that hadn't seen any real action in years, nestled deep in the heart of Montana, a town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever seemed to change. People lived simple lives, their routines predictable, and the small-town charm was something Jason had come to appreciate over the past few years. For someone like him, a former soldier, this was the kind of place that allowed him to stay out of the spotlight and away from the ghosts of his past. Jason, once a decorated Special Forces operative, had left behind the high-stakes world of military combat after a brutal IED explosion in Afghanistan took both of his legs. The loss was a painful reminder of the brutal realities of war, but it also became the catalyst for the life Jason had been forced to live since then. He had returned home as a war hero, but the world didn't quite know how to treat a hero who came back broken, physically and emotionally. Jason found solace in the quiet life of Cedarville, where people saw only what they expected to see, a disabled veteran who had struggled to move on. The wheelchair became his shield, hiding his past and his true identity from the world. But the wheelchair wasn't just a symbol of his loss. It was a well-crafted piece of engineering, designed to be as much a combat tool as it was a means of mobility. Jason had spent years modifying it, hiding gadgets and technology that no one, not even the most trained of eyes, could detect. Beneath its surface were hidden compartments for weapons, communication devices, and even tools that would make it possible for him to defend himself in a way that no one would expect from a man in a chair. The chair, in a way, had become part of his camouflage, a way to blend in and move undetected. Jason's current life in Cedarville was far removed from his former life in the military, but his new purpose was just as intense. He had assumed the role of a disabled vet in this town with an air of helplessness, but in reality, he was an undercover FBI agent on a critical mission, to infiltrate and dismantle a dangerous criminal empire led by the Red Dragons motorcycle gang. This gang was no ordinary group of thugs. They were deeply involved in weapons trafficking, smuggling military-grade arms across state lines and even internationally. The Red Dragons were ruthless, and their operation had grown vast, operating in the Pacific Northwest like an unchecked plague. They had connections at every level of society, making them nearly untouchable. Jason had been working undercover for months, gathering intel and keeping a low profile. His role was crucial. As a disabled veteran, no one would ever suspect him of being anything other than what he appeared to be, a broken man trying to live out his days in peace. The FBI needed someone who could blend in, someone who would be overlooked, and Jason was the perfect candidate. His injury had granted him a form of invisibility, allowing him to observe the gang's operations without raising suspicion. He would act as the perfect bait, letting the Red Dragons get too comfortable, thinking they had the upper hand. They thought him weak. But that was exactly what made him so dangerous. His days in Cedarville had become a delicate balance of playing the part of the helpless veteran while gathering valuable intelligence. His interactions were limited, mostly with the people who ran the local businesses like Jenny, the young cafe owner who had become one of the few people to know his true identity. Jenny had become someone he could trust, though their bond was far from conventional. They didn't discuss Jason's work, nor did she ask too many questions. She just knew that he wasn't the man everyone thought he was. Jason had learned to use his quiet days in Cedarville to keep tabs on the Red Dragons. Their leader, Marcus the Snake Wilson, had been on the FBI's radar for a long time, and Jason was the agent who had been assigned to bring him and his gang down. But the task wasn't going to be easy. The Red Dragons had long been operating in the shadows, their criminal activities wrapped in layers of corruption and secrecy. The weapons trafficking operation was only the surface of what the FBI was after. Beneath it lay a network of criminals, from low-level gang members to high-ranking officials in law enforcement, all of whom were protecting the gang's illegal activities. Jason's job wasn't just about infiltrating the gang, it was about being patient. He had to wait for the right moment to strike, to expose their operation at its core. And that meant biding his time, making sure he didn't do anything that would blow his cover. His goal was clear: gather the evidence, identify the key players, and take down the empire. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. He would need his allies in the FBI to back him up when the time came. As Jason wheeled himself down the cracked sidewalks of Cedarville that day, the weight of his concealed weapon pressing against his lower back, he couldn't help but feel the familiar sense of alertness that came with his years of combat training. Even in a place like Cedarville, where the biggest excitement was a stray dog running through the streets, Jason never allowed himself to let his guard down. Old habits died hard. The simple act of maneuvering his chair around the town was a constant exercise in vigilance. He never failed to assess his surroundings, noting exits, sight lines, potential threats. It was second nature, a reflex ingrained into him by years of training in the military. Even the smallest distraction could be a fatal mistake. But today, something felt different. The usual quietness of the town seemed to be laced with an underlying tension. As he approached the cafe where he usually stopped for coffee, he saw a group of men standing outside, laughing loudly, their leather vests and patches bearing the unmistakable insignia of the Red Dragons. Jason's heart rate remained steady, but his mind immediately shifted into combat mode. The Dragons had made their move. They had been circling around him for weeks, and now it seemed they were ready to make their move. Little did they know, they were about to walk right into the trap he had set. The Red Dragons were about to discover that the broken man in the wheelchair was anything but weak. Tension builds as the Red Dragons confront Jason. Jason Statham sat at the corner of the cafe, his back straight, his gaze steady. He kept his coffee cup in hand, as though he were just another local having a quiet afternoon. But beneath this calm exterior, the situation was beginning to escalate, and he was fully aware of it. The moment the door to the cafe opened, Jason's trained instincts kicked into overdrive. 3 men in leather jackets bearing the Red Dragon's insignia walked in. Their presence was impossible to ignore. Their loud voices and swaggering demeanor immediately set them apart from the usual customers who had long grown accustomed to Jason's presence. The air shifted. It wasn't just the cafe that had changed, but the entire town seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. Jason didn't need to glance at the patchwork tattoos or the way they positioned themselves to recognize who they were. He knew these men. They were Red Dragons, dangerous, unpredictable, and ruthless. He had seen them around town before, but today was different. There was an unmistakable tension in the air, a sense that something was about to break. Jason had been through enough combat scenarios to know when a situation was about to turn dangerous, and he had already begun calculating his options. The objective was simple: remain calm, protect his cover, and avoid engaging in any unnecessary violence. Yet, the danger was becoming palpable, and he had to prepare himself for whatever might come next. Marcus the Snake Wilson, the leader of the Red Dragons, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the cafe. "Well, look who it is," he sneered, his tone dripping with mock respect. "Our favorite local hero," he continued, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on Jason. Jason didn't flinch. He had been in far worse situations than this, and he had learned a long time ago that staying calm was often the best weapon. "Marcus," Jason responded, keeping his voice neutral. He adjusted his chair slightly, angling it for a quicker escape if things went south. The cafe was small, the tables crammed together in a way that made movement difficult, but that wasn't an issue for Jason. His wheelchair was designed to move swiftly through tight spaces. In combat, he had adapted many of the techniques he had once used standing, finding ways to maximize his leverage from a seated position. But today, he had to keep his cool. This wasn't about a fight, it was about the long game. The Red Dragons didn't see it that way. To them, Jason was nothing more than an easy target, a broken man who had nothing left to fight for. They saw his disability as a weakness, a reason to harass him, to remind him of his place in their world. What they didn't know was that Jason had spent years perfecting a new set of combat techniques specifically designed for his condition. His wheelchair, though it appeared helpless to the untrained eye, was outfitted with technology that allowed him to move quickly and decisively. It could carry weapons, gadgets, and tools, transforming into a combat platform when the need arose. But now, his patience was his greatest weapon. Jason maintained his calm, allowing Marcus to approach, to draw closer. "You know what I can't figure out?" Marcus leaned in, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and cigarettes. "How someone like you manages to always be around when we're doing business. It's almost like you're watching us." The venom in his voice was unmistakable. There was no doubt in Jason's mind that Marcus was testing him, trying to provoke a reaction. He wanted to see fear, weakness, something that would confirm his own superiority. But Jason wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. "I live here, Marcus," Jason said, his voice as steady as ever. "Not much else to do in a small town." Marcus wasn't satisfied with that answer. The tension was rising. "Not much else, huh?" He took another step forward, his eyes flashing with menace. "Maybe you should consider finding somewhere else to be. You know, accidents happen to people in chairs all the time." Jason's grip on the armrest of his wheelchair tightened imperceptibly, but he didn't let his emotions show. Every nerve in his body screamed for action, but he forced himself to breathe, to remember why he was here. His mission had to come first. The evidence they were collecting on the Red Dragons was crucial. A hasty move could compromise everything. His patience would be his strength. The gang members behind Marcus, including Rick Razor Thompson, his right-hand man, spread out in a tactical pattern. Jason's mind raced, analyzing the situation. He could feel the surge of adrenaline, the sharpness of his military instincts kicking in. He knew exactly how to take down these men, to incapacitate them in seconds. But there was a bigger picture to consider. The weapon shipment the FBI had been tracking was coming in soon, and everything depended on Jason's ability to keep his cover intact. But Marcus wasn't letting up. He grabbed Jason's chair, spinning him to face him, his face twisted into a smug grin. "You've got one day to leave town, sweetheart," he sneered, the malice in his words unmistakable. "After that," he grinned, revealing his gold-capped teeth, "let's just say we know people at the VA. Those benefit checks can get lost real easy." Jason allowed a small tremor to shake his voice. It was subtle, but it was enough to make Marcus believe he was frightened, enough to make him feel like he had the upper hand. Inside, Jason's emotions were a storm, but he controlled them with a calm that had been ingrained in him over the years. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he let them fall, letting the fear show just enough to sell the act. "Smart boy," Marcus said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Now, let's show you what trouble looks like." He nodded to Crusher, the gang's enforcer, who grinned widely. The next few moments were crucial. Jason's mind raced through the scenarios, but as Crusher reached for his chair, Jason had already made his decision. Well, look who it is," Marcus the Snake Wilson's voice rang out, carrying across the cafe. His tone was dripping with mock respect, and the venom was evident in his words. "Our favorite local hero," he sneered, clearly enjoying the power he had over Jason. To the rest of the cafe's patrons, it might have seemed like a harmless exchange, but to Jason, it was a carefully orchestrated game. Marcus was testing him, pushing his buttons, trying to provoke a reaction. He wanted to see fear, weakness, something that would confirm his own dominance. Jason's chair angled slightly, positioning himself for quick movement if necessary. "Marcus," Jason replied coolly, his voice neutral. He kept his focus on the gang leader, making sure his body language stayed relaxed. He didn't want to give anything away. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." The words were casual, but Jason's mind was on high alert. Every word, every gesture, was part of the act. He had perfected this role, playing the helpless veteran who was easy prey. The Red Dragons thought they had him figured out. They thought they knew everything about him. But Jason knew better. And he had no intention of letting them realize the truth until it was too late. Marcus wasn't satisfied with Jason's response. He leaned in closer, his breath stinking of cigarettes and cheap whiskey. "You know, I can't figure it out," he muttered, his voice dripping with menace. "How someone like you manages to always be around when we're doing business. It's almost like you're watching us." Jason's grip on his chair tightened slightly, but he didn't let it show. He had been through this before. The gang had harassed him countless times, trying to push him, testing his limits. But each time, he let them think they were in control. They had no idea that Jason had been playing them all along. "I live here, Marcus," Jason said, his voice calm, measured. "Small town. Not many places to be." His response was calculated, a deliberate attempt to downplay the situation. But Marcus wasn't letting it go. He took a step closer, his voice dropping low. "Not many places, huh? Maybe you should find somewhere else to be," he said, his words dripping with malice. "Accidents happen to people in chairs all the time." Jason's mind raced through the possibilities. He could feel the tension in the room, the way the other gang members were circling him. They were trying to provoke him, trying to force him into a reaction that would give them a reason to escalate. But Jason wasn't going to take the bait. Not today. Instead, he let fear show in his eyes. Just enough. It was a calculated move, a slight tremor in his voice as he responded. "I understand," he said, looking down as though trying to control his emotions. "I don't want any trouble." It was a lie, of course. Jason was always prepared for trouble, always ready to defend himself when the need arose. But the mission came first. He couldn't afford to blow his cover, not now, not when the Red Dragons were so close to making the shipment that would seal their fate. Marcus straightened up, his smug grin returning. "Smart boy," he said, nodding in approval. "Now, let's show you what trouble looks like." He motioned for Crusher, one of his enforcers, to grab Jason's chair. The moment Crusher laid his hands on it, Jason knew that the time for playing passive was over. The chair was tipped, and Jason was thrown to the ground. Coffee spilled everywhere, and the gang erupted into laughter, their jeers filling the cafe. It was a humiliation, but Jason kept his focus. As he lay there, pretending to struggle, he burned their faces into his memory. This was part of the plan. He let them believe they had won. It was all part of the long game. Today, Jason would play weak. But the real fight was coming, and when it arrived, the Red Dragons wouldn't stand a chance. The mission to capture the Red Dragons and dismantle the Empire. As the days dragged on in Cedarville, Jason's sense of anticipation continued to build. His time had come. The Red Dragons, overconfident and increasingly reckless, had made their move. They thought they had driven him out of town, made him a non-factor. But in their arrogance, they had played right into his hands. The carefully laid-out plan was now in motion, and Jason was ready to see it through to the end. The weapons shipment that had been the focus of the investigation for months was coming in that very night, and the Red Dragons were moving full steam ahead with their operation. Jason had played his part to perfection. By pretending to leave town, he had not only gained their confidence but also given them a false sense of security. They thought they had intimidated a weak, helpless man into submission. What they didn't realize was that Jason had orchestrated the entire situation, building their hubris until they felt invincible. His phone buzzed, and Jason glanced at the screen. It was another message from Agent Cooper. "The shipment is confirmed. We move tonight." Jason's pulse quickened, but he didn't let it show. He knew what needed to be done. His role in this operation was to get close to the Red Dragons, gather information, and expose their illegal activities. Now, it was time for the final push. The plan was simple yet intricate. Jason had to make the Red Dragons believe that he was still planning to leave town, which would allow him to move around the city without raising suspicion. They had already seen him loading boxes into his truck, making a show of packing up his things. Jenny, the cafe owner, had been helping him create the illusion that he was leaving, staging everything perfectly so that even the most vigilant Red Dragon member would believe it. Jason's wheelchair was still loaded with gadgets, and his body was tuned for action. His chair was equipped with small but powerful EMP devices that could disable electronics at a distance, and hidden compartments held weapons, gadgets, and other tools. He had spent countless hours perfecting the adjustments to his chair, making sure that each piece of gear was as efficient as possible, all while maintaining the facade of a disabled veteran. The truth was, the wheelchair was one of his greatest assets. While it might have appeared to limit his movement, It actually allowed him to approach situations from a unique angle. As he wheeled through the town on the night of the operation, his focus remained sharp. His chair's wheels glided silently over the cracked pavement as he approached his home on the outskirts of Cedarville. It was a modest ranch house, chosen carefully for its clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. This house had been his base of operations for the past 3 years, and it had served him well. The house was secure, and Jason went through his usual checks. Everything was in place. As he settled into his routine, he allowed himself a brief moment of respite. But he knew this was no time for complacency. The operation was in full swing, and the Red Dragons were closer than ever to making the biggest mistake of their criminal lives. Jason was ready to pull the trigger on a plan that had been in the making for months. His phone buzzed again, another message from Cooper. It was a reminder, don't engage early. Wait for backup. Jason nodded to himself, keeping his nerves in check. He knew the FBI was close, positioned at various points around the town, ready to move in once the Red Dragons made their move. But Jason had a crucial role to play before that could happen. As the sun set on Cedarville, Jason shifted his focus to the lumber mill. This was where the Red Dragons were set to make their weapons delivery. It was a perfect location for a covert operation, as the mill was far from the main road, surrounded by trees and abandoned buildings. It was also far enough from town that any law enforcement presence would be difficult to detect. The Red Dragons had set up a meeting with cartel buyers at the mill, and Jason knew it was his chance to strike. The plan was for Jason to get close to the mill, observe the situation, and identify key targets. He had already mapped out the terrain, noting all the potential escape routes and the best vantage points for observing the exchange. The FBI's job was to move in once Jason had identified the buyers and the weapons, but Jason had to be the one to make the initial move. He had to be in the right place at the right time, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. As night fell over Cedarville, Jason wheeled himself into position. His wheelchair moved silently through the shadows, its custom suspension allowing him to glide over uneven ground without a sound. The night was cold, and the stars above offered little comfort. But Jason was used to operating in the darkness. His training had prepared him for moments like this, where silence and stealth were his greatest allies. He approached the lumber mill cautiously, positioning himself behind an old office building. The place was quiet, but Jason knew better than to take that as a sign of safety. The Red Dragons had been running operations for years, and they knew how to keep a low profile when necessary. But tonight, they were overconfident. They thought Jason was out of the picture. As he surveyed the area, Jason's mind worked through every possible scenario. His wheelchair was not just a tool for mobility, it was an essential part of his strategy. From his seated position, he had a lower profile than any of the Red Dragons, who were used to facing threats at eye level. That gave him an advantage. Jason was always aware of his surroundings, and he had made sure to position himself at the right angle to keep an eye on everything without being seen. Through his night vision scope, Jason saw movement at the north end of the mill. It was a convoy, 3 trucks, moving into the area. The buyers had arrived. This was the moment Jason had been waiting for. He could see the Red Dragons moving into position, their bodies tense, their hands hovering over their weapons. This was about to escalate quickly. Jason's mind raced as he observed the scene. The Red Dragons were so focused on the buyers that they had failed to notice the FBI team closing in from the west. Jason could hear the crackle of communication in his earpiece. All units in position. Move on my signal. Jason took a deep breath, his fingers tightening on the controls of his chair. He was ready. The next few moments would determine the fate of the entire operation. He would have to rely on his instincts, his training, and the tools at his disposal to take down the Red Dragons and their entire weapons operation. But Jason had prepared for this moment his entire life. He was ready for the fight. The air was thick with tension as the first shots rang out in the distance. Jason wheeled himself silently into position, the mission now in full swing. The Red Dragons had no idea what was coming for them. They thought they had him out of the picture, but they were about to learn the hard way that Jason Statham wasn't just a man in a wheelchair. He was a warrior, and tonight, he would bring down their entire empire. The battle at the lumber mill. The lumber mill stood in the shadow of the mountains, its rusted buildings and overgrown pathways a testament to the years of disuse. Despite its dilapidated exterior, it had become the perfect location for the Red Dragon's illegal dealings. Its secluded position, surrounded by trees and only accessible by dirt roads, made it an ideal hideout for the gang. The night had fallen over Cedarville, and Jason had already positioned himself, hidden in the shadows, watching as the Red Dragons made their move. The Red Dragons had no idea they were walking straight into a trap. They had underestimated Jason and his ability to remain hidden, thinking that he had been driven out of town. They thought they had defeated the broken veteran in the wheelchair, but Jason was no ordinary disabled man. He was an undercover FBI agent, a combat specialist who had spent years honing his skills for moments like this. Every move, every inch of ground, was calculated. His wheelchair, designed with custom modifications, gave him a unique advantage, a lower profile and a silent approach that the Red Dragons were ill-prepared to face. Jason had spent months observing the Red Dragons, learning their routines, their tactics, and their weaknesses. The lumber mill was the key to bringing down their entire operation, and tonight was the night he would do just that. His mission was simple: gather the evidence, neutralize the gang members, and ensure that the weapons were seized before they could reach their buyers. But things were never that simple when it came to the Red Dragons. The convoy had arrived. 3 trucks, loaded with weapons and military-grade hardware, were parked in a clearing near the mill's loading dock. The gang members were spread out in a perimeter, securing the area and preparing for the exchange. Jason could see Marcus, the Snake Wilson, and his right-hand man, Rick Razor Thompson, among the group. They were overseeing the operation, completely unaware that the FBI was closing in on them. Jason had positioned himself strategically behind a stack of crates, his wheelchair silent as he made minute adjustments to his equipment. His heart rate remained steady, his mind focused on the task at hand. He couldn't afford any mistakes. Through his night vision scope, Jason surveyed the area. The buyers had arrived, their SUVs parked just outside the clearing. The Red Dragons had set up the meeting, their usual arrogance evident in the way they carried themselves. But Jason had a different plan. He was here to make sure that this operation ended tonight, and he wouldn't allow the Red Dragons to escape. As the minutes ticked by, Jason moved with silent precision, his wheelchair gliding through the shadows. He was a ghost in the night, his movements so fluid and quiet that even the most experienced gang member wouldn't notice him until it was too late. His wheelchair had been modified to allow him the freedom of movement that many would think impossible for someone in a chair. The lightweight frame, reinforced for combat, allowed him to maneuver quickly. Hidden compartments carried small, powerful EMP devices that could disable electronics, making him a formidable force even against armed adversaries. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the message from Agent Cooper coming through loud and clear: "Teams in position. Don't engage early. We're on standby until you give the signal." Jason's eyes narrowed as he checked the area one last time. The Red Dragons were moving their weapons into the mill, and the buyers were preparing to make the exchange. It was only a matter of time before the situation escalated into a full-blown shootout. Jason had to act fast. The first shots rang out. A group of gang members, clearly getting nervous about the buyers' movements, opened fire into the trees, thinking they had seen movement. It was a sudden, chaotic flare of gunfire that sent the entire mill into an uproar. Jason's heart raced, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate. He knew that the chaos would be his opportunity. The Red Dragons were too focused on the potential threat from the buyers to notice the FBI closing in from all directions. Jason wheeled himself into position, moving around the mill's exterior to get a better angle on the exchange. The Red Dragons had no idea that they were being surrounded by law enforcement. Their focus remained solely on the buyers and the weapons, unaware that their world was about to come crashing down. Jason's chair moved silently through the yard, his keen eyes watching every movement, every twitch of a muscle. He knew that one mistake could blow the entire operation, but he also knew this was his chance to bring down the gang once and for all. He found an elevated position behind a stack of lumber, where he could see the entire scene unfold. The first group of buyers was already unloading their cash, and the Red Dragons were moving the crates of weapons into place. But Jason could tell something wasn't right. The buyers were nervous, their eyes darting around the clearing. They hadn't expected the Red Dragons to be so heavily armed. Jason's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. His scope picked up the slight movement of a man in the shadows, a figure who wasn't part of the original exchange. This wasn't just a simple weapons deal. This was an auction. Two rival groups of buyers were competing for the weapons. The Red Dragons had set them up, playing both sides against each other to drive up the price. Jason's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a weapons shipment. It was a bloodbath waiting to happen. "Cooper," he whispered into his comms, "we've got a second buyer group approaching from the east. This is bigger than we thought. I need backup now." The response came back immediately. "Copy that, Jason. We're moving in." The tension was palpable now. Jason could see the conflict beginning to escalate as the buyers realized they had been caught in a dangerous game. The first group pulled their weapons, and chaos erupted. Bullets began to fly as the Red Dragons scrambled to defend their shipment. Jason stayed low, using his chair's low profile to remain unseen. The fight quickly became a blur of gunfire and shouting, the sound of metal hitting metal and the sharp crack of gunshots piercing the air. Jason's training kicked in as he maneuvered through the scene, remaining calm amidst the chaos. He knew what he had to do. The buyers were caught in the crossfire, and the Red Dragons were losing control of the situation. But Jason had been trained for moments like this. He moved through the smoke, taking out gang members one by one with precise, calculated movements. His wheelchair was a weapon, the perfect tool for stealth and precision. As he moved closer to the fight, Jason spotted Marcus Wilson near the back of the mill, rallying his men and trying to maintain control. But it was too late. The chaos was already spiraling out of control. FBI agents had already moved in, securing the exits and preventing anyone from escaping. Jason's mission was almost complete. The Red Dragons were surrounded, and there was no way out for them. The moment of truth had arrived. Jason wheeled himself forward, his chair gliding silently as he approached Marcus. The Red Dragon leader was distracted, shouting orders at his men. He never saw Jason coming. In one swift motion, Jason swung his chair into position and fired, taking out one of Marcus's men in a single shot. Marcus turned, his eyes widening in shock. He had underestimated Jason, just like everyone else. And now, the FBI was here, closing in from all sides. "You're done, Marcus," Jason said, his voice low and steady. "This ends tonight." The battle at the lumber mill had reached its apex, and as the dust began to settle, Jason Statham knew the operation was coming to its conclusion. The Red Dragons were on the verge of being dismantled, their weapons shipments seized, and the key players in their empire were finally within the grasp of the FBI. But Jason had learned one thing throughout this entire mission. It was never over until the last piece fell into place. His mind, sharp as ever, was already anticipating the next move. The chaos in the mill had been swift and brutal. As the FBI moved in, agents quickly overwhelmed the remaining Red Dragon members, taking them down with precision. The sound of helicopters overhead signaled that the operation had reached its final stages. The buyers who had come to make their purchase had been caught in the crossfire, their deal turned into a firefight that would end with their capture. Jason, using his wheelchair's unique modifications, had been everywhere, striking from angles no one expected. His calm and calculated movements had confused and disoriented the gang, allowing the FBI to secure the entire site with minimal casualties. Marcus, the Snake Wilson, the leader of the Red Dragons, had been cornered by Jason in the final moments of the fight. The man who had taunted him, who had threatened his life and mocked his disability, was now at Jason's mercy. Jason's chair crept forward silently, his hand steady as he raised the weapon in his lap, aiming it directly at Marcus's chest. The world around them seemed to slow. The tension in the air was thick with the finality of the moment. Marcus's smirk faded as he realized that everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was crumbling before him. Jason spoke calmly, his voice a stark contrast to the chaos around them. "This ends tonight, Marcus," he said, the words carrying the weight of everything that had led up to this point. "Your empire, your operation, it's over." The Red Dragon leader sputtered, his eyes wide with disbelief. You're just a broken man in a wheelchair." Marcus sneered, still unable to fully comprehend how this moment had come to be. "How did you?" Jason's expression didn't waver. "You thought my disability made me weak, Marcus," he said, his voice cold and firm. "But it was the perfect cover. You were so focused on what you saw, you never bothered to understand what I was capable of." His hand tightened on the trigger, his resolve unshaken. This was the moment of reckoning for the Red Dragons. With the sound of Marcus's gun clattering to the floor, Jason made the final arrest, securing him and the rest of the gang with the help of the FBI team. The operation had been a success, but Jason knew this was only the beginning. His part was far from over. The weapons had been seized, the Red Dragons were apprehended, but there was still a far-reaching criminal network to take down. The evidence gathered tonight would fuel investigations across the country, exposing corrupt officials and dismantling the trafficking ring that had operated unchecked for far too long. As Jason wheeled himself to the Central Command Unit, he could already hear the voices of agents and officers coordinating their next moves. The FBI teams were in place, securing the remaining buyers and neutralizing the last of the threats. The operation was a success, but Jason's job was far from over. He wasn't just a soldier playing a role. He was a key player in an ongoing war against corruption, violence, and injustice. In the aftermath, as the federal agents began their work, Jason found a moment of stillness. The chaos had subsided, but the weight of the mission still hung over him. His wheelchair had taken him from one mission to another, from Afghanistan to Cedarville, and now it had served him in the most important operation of his career. As he looked around the lumber mill, he could see the remains of the battle, broken crates, empty weapons cases, and the faintest traces of gunfire on the walls. But beneath it all was the sense of something much larger: justice. Jason's phone buzzed once again, a message from Cooper flashing on the screen. "Great work, Jason. The operation was a success. We're already moving forward with Phase 2. You've done more than just take down the Red Dragons. You've exposed a far-reaching network of corruption." Jason leaned back in his chair, looking up at the stars above the mill. The night sky, once dark and filled with the tension of the mission, now seemed peaceful, almost serene. The first rays of dawn were beginning to break, casting their golden light over the mill. It was a new day, but Jason knew the fight wasn't over. The corruption that had allowed the Red Dragons to operate so freely still existed. The evidence they had uncovered tonight would shake the foundation of law enforcement and government agencies. The Red Dragons were just the beginning. There was more to uncover, more to dismantle, and Jason was already preparing for the next phase. As Jason wheeled back to his secure location, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night's events pressing against his chest. It had been a long journey, one that had taken him from the depths of despair to the heights of justice. His legs were gone, taken from him in an explosion years ago. But in their place, he had gained something far more powerful: an unbreakable will, a sense of purpose, and the conviction that he could still make a difference. As the FBI continued its work in Cedarville, Jason's mind raced through the next steps. There was still so much to do. But one thing was certain: the Red Dragons had been taken down, their empire shattered. And Jason Statham, the disabled veteran, had played a pivotal role in making sure that justice prevailed. The world had underestimated him, just like the gang had. But they would never make that mistake again. Jason's wheelchair hummed softly as he moved away from the scene, the quiet sound echoing in the empty night. He was a man on a mission, always moving forward, always ready for the next challenge. And in the shadows of the world, those who thought they were safe, those who had hidden behind corruption and crime, would soon learn that there was no place to hide from the justice that was coming for them. The story of Jason Statham, the disabled veteran who brought down a criminal empire, was far from over. It was just the beginning. Title: The Disabled Veteran Who Took Down a Criminal Empire, Full Action Movie. Description: In the quiet town of Cedarville, a disabled veteran living a simple life becomes the key player in a mission to dismantle one of the largest weapons trafficking operations in the Pacific Northwest. Jason Statham, once a lethal military combat specialist, has been hiding his true identity behind the guise of a helpless veteran in a wheelchair. But when the notorious Red Dragons motorcycle gang targets him, they unknowingly set off a chain of events that will lead to their downfall. Jason, an undercover FBI agent, has spent months infiltrating the gang and gathering evidence on their illegal activities. As the Red Dragons prepare to make their biggest weapons shipment, Jason is ready to strike, using every combat technique he has perfected during his time in the military. The gang, led by Marcus the Snake Wilson, has no idea that their victim is actually a highly trained operative, and they are about to learn that the most dangerous opponent is the one they least expect. Watch as Jason takes down the Red Dragons, one by one, using his wheelchair as an unexpected weapon and outsmarting the gang at every turn. With the FBI closing in, Jason must balance his patience and precision to ensure the success of the mission while maintaining his cover. This thrilling action-packed movie shows that sometimes appearances can be deceiving, and underestimating a disabled veteran can be a deadly mistake. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more thrilling action and suspense-filled stories. Hashtags. Hashtag disabled veteran, hashtag FBI, hashtag action movie, hashtag weapons trafficking, hashtag undercover mission, hashtag Red Dragons gang, hashtag Jason Statham, hashtag combat specialist, hashtag criminal empire, hashtag thriller, hashtag action, hashtag suspense, hashtag justice, hashtag lethal combat, hashtag wheelchair combat. Tags. Jason Statham. Disabled veteran action. FBI undercover mission. Weapons trafficking action movie. Red Dragons motorcycle gang. Combat wheelchair. Thriller movie. Undercover FBI agent. Criminal empire. Action-packed thriller. Military combat specialist. Justice and revenge story. Secret agent film. Action movie 2025. Suspense and action movie. Disabled veteran hero. FBI agent story. Red Dragons gang movie. Tactical combat wheelchair. Thrilling undercover operations. Criminal empire dismantled.